what matters is not who writes what or who says what in the next few days. It is about whether he can reset the trajectory ahead of the next election, and constitutional details will be forgiven if that's the case. They will only matter if he's rubbish. Yep. And that's what he needs to be, is not rubbish.
Welcome one and all. Welcome to How to Win an Election. I'm the underqualified Chief of Staff, Hugo Rifkind, and I'm joined by three strategic masterminds. I'm tipping them all to be Andy Burnham's chancellor, but they're also going to be Home and Foreign Secretaries too. And they are former Labour insider Sally Morgan. Hello, Sally.
Hello.
How are you keeping?
Very good, thank you.
Good to have you here. Policy Queen Polly Mackenzie. Hello, Polly.
I've had 2 coffees today.
What, are you going to go wild?
You never know.
What insane policies will come out? I don't know, put kittens in the army? What's it going to be?
I was going to say babies in the army, actually, but no, yours is better.
Yeah.
Kittens can be violent. We've got 2 kittens, and they tried to eat a butterfly, and my daughter got very upset and fought the kittens for the butterfly. The butterfly died, she got scratched. And it wasn't good. I'm saying maybe this is what NATO needs to be thinking about.
As long as the Russians primarily arm themselves with butterflies, we'll be absolutely fine. We are also imminently to be joined by Tory peer and Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein, who's running a bit late. Perhaps one too many Diet Cokes after the football. Look, Andy Burnham's going to be putting together his cabinet. Would any of you like to rule yourselves out now?
Yes.
Yes? Yeah. Polly?
Well, I mean, if the call comes to serve, I'm not going to say no.
If the ball comes loose from the scrum...
Well, obviously, as we've repeatedly discussed, you and I, Hugo, are wanting a peerage.
Yes, for sure. Well,
in order to really belong on this podcast.
Ideally 2 peerages. It's not a job share.
Fine. One each. Yeah. And ergo,
Big tent.
Yeah.
Exactly. No. I'm sure that what Andy Burnham needs is a very big tent, large enough to cover the whole of the Birmingham to Manchester area. Big enough for me.
I am very good at putting up tents, so I'm here to serve if required. Look, do get in touch with your questions if you have them. Send them to howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. Barry emailed us. He writes, "Dear all, love the programme and the balance between great political insights from your collective experiences and the humour and banter between you. I'm sure many other listeners share my game every week, trying to guess which sound bites, phrases or snippets from the programme will make it into the opening sequence the following week. I'm highly confident that Polly's comment that being a woman does not in fact make you perfect will make the cut for next week. Regards, Barry." Well done, Barry. Play the horses. Let's crack on. As I say, if you hear a door swing open, that'll be Danny Finkelstein belatedly joining us. I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that Andy Burnham is going to win the Labour leadership contest, what with it now being impossible for him not to. And that means he'll be in Downing Street next week, and we're going to talk about how a new PM introduces themselves to the nation. We're also going to talk about the Clacton by-election a little bit later. First up, look, Sally, I know we've said this before, but it remains true. Is it not remarkable that he's this close to power and we still only have a few crumbs of information about what he intends to do once he gets it?
I don't think it's that remarkable. I mean, I suppose I differ. I know that is the general view and everybody's writing that. I think actually people have got if you really delve and you look at what he's done over the last couple of decades, I think people can have a pretty clear view of his approach to being Prime Minister. And I think, it will partly be about how he does politics differently. And I think I actually think the country's ready for that, and that'll be really important. I think people have got a pretty clear idea where he is on the kind of, if you like, social home affairs sort of agenda. I think that came through very strongly in the by-election, but I think if you look at who he's worked with in the past, you'd see that as well. I mean, of course, on the economy, people are going to be looking and questioning what's going to come next, but I think there is evidence in Manchester of what his general approach will be.
But do you think he is going to A, do something radical on tax, or B, not do something radical on tax? Because that seems like a big deal. It
is a big deal. I mean, at the moment, he has said he's going to stay within the manifesto, which means he's going to go as radical as he can, in my view, but within the manifesto. I happen to think, and I always thought this about Keir as well, that there was the opportunity to say, look, I know that's where we were, but I think we're going to have to go outside that. I suspect Andy's not going to, having ruled it out in the by-election.
Paul, do you think we know what we're getting?
I think we can hypothesise plenty, and really what those writing about their sudden constitutional concerns are really saying is that they don't quite know what to write. Which is interesting because, as a general rule, political commentators don't write much about policy. They prefer just talking about political dynamics and who's up and who's down. So I don't think...
I'm right here. You don't need to be... I know Danny isn't, but I'm right here. You don't need to be so rude.
All of them, Hugo.
Not all of them.
I was thinking more of the BBC. But so if Andy Burnham had in fact published a Burnham-ism manifesto of 20,000 words setting out essentially, detailed white paper level policies, everyone would be saying, this is really boring. This proves that Andy Burnham's quite boring and doesn't understand that policy isn't what shifts votes. So,
and say, what a cheek, actually. Why I mean, they respond in the opposite way in some ways.
In the end, Danny isn't here, so we can speak ill of him and his view that if the Prime Minister changes without an election, the Prime Minister is constitutionally bound to call an election. I don't really think that's what voters care about in the end, nor stuff about whether you are kind of loyal to paragraph 17B of the manifesto. What they care about is whether their lives are getting better, which is, of course, another thing that Danny tends to say. And so what matters is not who writes what or who says what in the next few days. It is about whether he can reset the trajectory ahead of the next election, and constitutional details will be forgiven if that's the case. They will only matter if he's rubbish.
Yep.
And that's what he needs to be, is not rubbish.
Look, shush, he's here now, so you better take back what you just said about Pinner and Diet Coke. Danny Finkelstein, do you agree with what Polly just said?
Yeah, I always agree. I was just, in fact, telling someone on the train as we were delayed how incredibly perspicacious Polly is. Quite seriously.
Good word.
Hello, Christian.
I might get that put on a T-shirt.
Hello, Christian.
Danny
That's the man I met.
I don't think she sweats that much. Danny, we were talking about whether Andy Burnham... Whether it's remarkable that we don't know more about what he's going to do, because he's given, look, he won't come in front of the Commons until September. He hasn't given many interviews. He just gave one, in fact, to Gary Lineker, which I looked at this morning. Interviewed by Gary Lineker yesterday, has 8,000 views on YouTube. If I'd interviewed Andy Burnham yesterday, nay, if I'd interviewed Gary Lineker yesterday, I would be disappointed if it only had 8,000 views on YouTube. I wonder if he's sort of got away with not saying so much about what he's going to do, because there is a sort of wave of sort of public, I don't know, just sort of shrug about even the fact that he's about to be Prime Minister.
I think there's a lot of scepticism about what anybody actually says at this point, because I think people were so disappointed at the reality of a Labour government, which they expected to change a lot and didn't. I mean, actually, if they've been listening to this podcast, they would have known that they didn't promise to change a lot, so it's not surprising they didn't. But nevertheless, people were surprised and disappointed, and so now they're just waiting to see what he does, and maybe they're not that interested in what he says. I mean, obviously, professionally, it's very interesting, and actually, Andy Burnham has said a lot about what he stands for. That's slightly different to what he'll do, of course, but he said a lot about what he stands for. So I am a bit surprised that during this period there hasn't been a more attempt to get information out of him personally, and clearly he's been interviewed by Gary Lineker. Partly that'll be strategic. I'm afraid the other reason, which is quite an interesting insight into him, is he'll just have been incapable of turning down the chance of being interviewed by Gary Lineker.
Well,
Yeah.
I think most of us would fall for that, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
I think that can be forgiven.
Yeah, he's a nice man, Gary Lineker. One doesn't agree with everything he says, but he's a very, very charming fellow. Look,
That's such a humble brag. You're like, obviously, I've met Gary Lineker multiple times.
The times
I've
that we've
never
had,
met Gary Lineker.
me and
I
Gary,
would,
do send in your I've met Gary Lineker stories. Look, the speculation over who's going to be in Burnham's cabinet, of course, continues. It's bad news for this man.
We're building the first fleet of SMRs in North Wales.
That is the sexy, sexy Ed Miliband. Because according to our colleague Patrick Maguire, senior allies of Andy Burnham think they've stopped Ed Miliband becoming Chancellor. Shabana Mahmood now seems to be the favourite. And yet, the word from Team Miliband is that Burnham genuinely hasn't decided yet. Sally, he must have decided yet, surely.
I would think he's probably pretty close to deciding if he hasn't actually decided, but I genuinely don't know what, and I think hardly anybody knows what he's going to do. You talk to people quite close in, they don't actually know what he's going to decide on any of these big posts. So do I think in his head he knows what he's doing? Of course I do. But has it gone any wider at the moment? No, it hasn't. So I do think it's speculation.
The theory, Polly, is when you're putting together a cabinet, when you're a Prime Minister putting together a cabinet, is you decide what your policy agenda is, and then you appoint people who fit that policy agenda. In practice, that's obviously not what happens, is it?
It needs to be as close to the truth as possible. But yes, you also need to think about how you're holding the coalition of your party together by signalling to kind of communities within the party that you care about the things that matter to them. For example, having Ian Duncan Smith in David Cameron's cabinet was very important for, holding together the sort of the more Eurosceptic wing of the party, and that then caused tensions because he wanted to reform welfare in ways that George Osborne didn't want. I think when it comes to the Chancellor, though, it's such a critical position that, I think signalling or who this trade union or that trade union wants has to be like 17th on the list. There may be one or two, maybe even three people who share Andy Burnham's vision and plan for what fiscal policy should be. And if you're choosing between those, I guess you can start to think about other things. But you have to be so close. If you have... You need a certain amount of tension between number 10 and number 11. But if what you've got is all-out war, you will, especially when the problem with the government we're just losing is that it was incoherent, he's got to correct for that. I think, I guess there was I quite like Ed Miliband. I quite like his policy agenda. He's clearly got a track record of achieving things. If I were Andy Burnham, the reason I'd be hesitating about him is that he doesn't really have much of a track record talking about devolution. And if we know one thing about Andy Burnham, it is that, other than that he doesn't like VAR, he definitely likes devolution and believes in it more than he wanted the Treasury to give him power when he was the mayor. So it's perfectly possible you can believe in that and then be the Prime Minister and stop believing the Treasury to give away power. But actually, the Treasury can be the greatest force for devolution, as it was under George Osborne, or it can be the biggest barrier to devolution. He needs somebody who is going to deliver that. My fear about Shabana Mahmood is I have no idea what she thinks about devolution or about fiscal policy.
I think what we know about Shabana, and I mean, you've said the same about Ed, to be fair, and I think you're right, Polly, is Shabana is running an incredibly effective political and policy operation at the Home Office. I mean, she's and actually at the dispatch box, she's pretty formidable, I think. And I think to an extent, I would have thought Andy will be making a decision about putting somebody into the Treasury who is going to run the Treasury rather than the Treasury running that person, which is what we've actually seen. So you've got to put somebody in who you think is going to be in charge and actually make the Treasury broadly follow what you want done. I also think the other thing that I think is going to happen is a much stronger economic operation in number 10, which everybody's talked about over these odd economic advisors, but single advisors sort of being the emissary from number 10 going and talking to the Treasury, not very successful in my experience. Having a serious unit with big people, I think, is different, and I think that's where Andy's likely to go. So I think there'll be a bit more of a counterbalance and a bit more conversation really between the two.
Danny, David Cameron and George Osborne were a very rare example of a Prime Minister and Chancellor between whom there appeared, at least externally to most of us, to be basically no tension at all. What was the secret to that? Did it involve them just simply being on the same page, or did Cameron actually sometimes have to defer to Osborne in a way that there
were two things I think that mattered. The first is they genuinely shared a project. They originally didn't actually. George kind of talked David round to, when they were backbench MPs, into a view about how the Conservative Party needs to change. Once David was persuaded of that, he was committed to it. So they shared a project. That was very important. Actually, a second thing is they shared a personal relationship, a personal friendship, very important. And the third thing is I think that George Osborne had decided Prime Minister was a very hard job. He wasn't ready to be the leader of the party at the time when David challenged for it.
He was very young at that point.
And
as well,
yes, he wasn't. And his view is he would be defined entirely by his faults at that point. I know because I spoke to him about it a lot. So the way this happened was that he was phoned up and told Michael Howard would be willing to make you shadow chancellor, but he wants some competition for the leadership of the party. are you prepared to run for the leadership of the party? George kind of dodged the question when asked it, and then was not sure what to do if Michael Howard put that question to him. So my advice to George was go to that meeting with Michael Howard. I bet he won't ask you directly. That call that you've had already, that was the asking. He's not going to ask you again. Just say yes to this job because it's extraordinary, and don't answer. So he said yes to the job, and the next day announced that he wasn't going to run for the leadership of the party, and never saw that running against David Cameron or undermining David Cameron or trying to push David Cameron out as something that he would do. So those three things made it possible. This is a very different situation. First of all, Andy Burnham has not, unlike, for example, the partnership between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, however dysfunctional it was actually a partnership. They did have a common political project, and that's what meant he didn't sack him, and what made it so hard for Tony Blair, because he couldn't really see the point of the dispute between them. So over a very long period of time, they had a political project. There, you can go back in history and look at people who didn't have a common political project but had a very good personal relationship, like Lloyd George and Bonner. That relationship, so you've got to have something. And at the moment, the problem with choosing a chancellor is not sure. I'm not clear whom he has either of those two things with. Maybe he does with James Purnell. That's why he's picked him. But anyone in Parliament, is there another figure who's ready to be chancellor he has that relationship with? I'm not sure. So I think in these situations that the best thing to do is be guided by the political logic rather than what you think he's decided, because the political logic is usually stronger than that. The problem is the political logic leads in two different directions. One is Ed Miliband deliver a more radical agenda with the kind of more Miata Fambula kind of way of looking at their agenda. The other is Shabana, who's more with the Josh Simons way of looking at it. The two of them are actually very different ways in which to guide the government.
They're not just very different; they're so different. Particularly if you add Rachel Reeves into the mix, into the mix as well.
I wouldn't bother doing that.
But those three futures as chancellor.
They're different choices, but they're not different.
They're so different that in 2005 there might have been like three parties would have voted on a general election.
Well, okay, but they're different. They're different policies. Okay, so they'll definitely make some different policy choices, but whether they're different directions is a different matter, right? So I think actually Andy Burnham does know what he wants to do about the direction of the country, which choices are the best to make. To get there, that is more difficult for him.
I agree with that completely. And actually, I don't think they're as different as you're making out,
Really?
in fact. No. And I also think if you look at... I would take one issue where I think Shabana would be incredibly closely allied to Andy, would be reskilling the British workforce. Looking at NEETs, looking at vocational education, looking at training, looking at apprenticeships, but also getting British people back to work.
None of that's the Treasury.
It's not the Treasury in operation, but I don't think Gordon ever just thought I'm doing monetary policy. I mean, actually, in terms of having big arguments about what you're going to do on getting people back to work, on welfare reform, and all the rest of it, the Treasury has to be there. Yeah. And I think she'd be very close to Andy on that, personally.
Polly, it's very possible that Burnham basically forms a government on Monday and then essentially goes into hibernation until September, not really appearing until the party conferences and the return of the Commons over the summer. Does the policy wonk in you just kind of sort of love the idea of government being able to do that with zero scrutiny, zero having to deal with the press, just get some stuff done for a few months, being left alone?
I think it's really unlikely that is what he will do. You know, they will have a 100 days plan of some sort. I hope it does include some sort of holiday for him, because downtime is just as important as public time. But they can and should keep some of those announcements relatively light. It's about mood music and change and signalling. They do need time to... Sally's just mentioned welfare reform. Whether it's welfare reform or mobilising skills and training, technology, healthcare treatment, to get this sort of segment of the population who are struggling with health conditions and as a result not working. There's a lot of complexity to design a plan for that. And if you go out with a quarter of the plan, people get upset and then you find yourself chasing your tail and it's a mess. So I certainly think that taking the 3 to 5 most important things they want to do and developing really serious plans which they can take out and announce at conference and really own that week as the reset is the right thing to do.
Let's look ahead now to the speech that Andy Burnham will give in Downing Street, presumably on Monday. You've all seen this moment happen up close numerous times. Danny, how significant is this as a moment in the life of a Prime Minister? I mean, you know, a Prime Minister giving a speech when they're just taking office.
I think it's in Theresa May's case, it was really significant. That was the moment she set the government, but she also set it a load of objectives it couldn't reach and which she didn't have the majority to achieve, and therefore it became very significant, first in a good way and then not in a particularly good way. And before that, I think it was probably less important. Because she was so successful with her words, and then the deeds didn't match the words, it became a sort of bigger moment than it had been until that point. I don't know whether the others agree.
I mean, I think it's. I think you're right that was that was a big moment. I don't think the lectern has always been a big deal. I mean, I actually can't remember the 97 lectern moment. I can remember the South Bank, and the speech on the South Bank was the definitive speech. You know, that was a new dawn has broken.
Yeah, but
I think it was also the campaigning as New Labour, governing as New Labour. I think it was. I think that phrase was there on the South Bank as well as then repeated at the lectern. So that was a really, really important statement.
Because I remember noticing it.
Yes,
No. Because I remember when Tony Blair said that, I thought, that was a very significant thing to say, and he definitely said it there.
And he said it absolutely definitive, and he looked at the people there and thought, I've got to say that. And it was more important to say it to the people who were gathered there than it was in Downing Street.
But irrespective of precisely where the moment is, whether it's at Downing Street or whether it's at the South Bank before.
But that's quite different in a sense, because that's different pictures, isn't it?
But I mean, Burnham, he's not going to have his South Bank moment because he's not troubling us with an election. But I mean, if you think back to, like Margaret Thatcher in 1979, quoting St Francis of Assisi, where there is discord, maybe bring harmony and all that kind of stuff, or Neve with there is work to be done. These are the moments they do define in history who a Prime Minister is, don't they?
They do, and very importantly, they send a message to Whitehall about what to prioritise and what you want to achieve. One of the things that Theresa May said, thinking of her speech, is she said that she wanted to focus on people who are just about managing. And as a result, suddenly every box note across Whitehall says that this policy is laser targeted at helping the just about managing. And then suddenly the Treasury is starting to do all this modelers to try and work out who she meant by people who are just about managing. And because Ed Miliband had previously said the squeezed middle and led to a similar thing around, which quartile, which deciles do you mean? And they always mean people who are actually richer than the average are included in the thing. Anyway, so it therefore matters most of all if you are clear about what your project is. Right? And I think Theresa May was clear about her project, but unfortunately it wasn't really a deliverable project, and she didn't have the majority to hold it together. So Andy Burnham could give a speech which says the three things, the three stories rather than policies that are going to be most important to his government. And that has a massive ripple effect throughout Whitehall. If he really means it, he's thought about it and he's going to hold to that, like governing as New Labour, then it will be profoundly impactful on his governing project. If, however, he says that and then says something else like in a month, or didn't really mean it, hadn't thought about, I meant devolution, but now I'm like, I really want the Treasury to be in charge. That's when the signals get confused and end up in mess.
Although I think they're going to go back to, and I don't know whether the Cameron government did this, but I think with James Bennett as Chief of Staff, they're going to go back to that. When you appoint the cabinet, there's the piece of paper and there's the priorities I want you to carry out for your department, which we always found incredibly important and effective, because you give it to the Secretary of State, you give it to the Perm Sec, there's your marching orders. I think they are going to go back to that.
Imagine not doing it.
How absurd to not do it.
But I think that did not happen in the last regime,
or in general. Actually, I think it was quite unusual. I think Polly's got it spot on, which is if Andy Burnham understands what his project is, he will be able to express it, and it will have some importance. And I think actually he does understand it. The difficulty will be as it was with Theresa May, turning that kind of aspiration into practical policies. Partly because you can it allows you to do a number of things, that particular project. However, I think it will be important and interesting. Whether it'll answer most of the big questions is a different matter.
I'm told that every PM since David Cameron has commissioned their own lectern, that they've replaced the lectern each time. Interested whether Andy Burnham's lectern, he's going to have one made, maybe a lectern made from Peter Hook's bass guitar or something like that. Should we acknowledge things like the lectern tradition more explicitly? Anyone got a favourite lectern?
But I think some of this stuff does matter, actually. The Palace are very good at it, like detailed symbolism of making sure that things have been made by artisanal craftspeople, or there's this flower or that flower. And yeah, you've got to be a bit of a geek to pay attention to that symbolism. But to those makers, it actually is very important. So, why not?
I like the idea of Burnham standing there at a lone synth, like a very lonely member of Kraftwerk or something like that. Look, when it was Cameron and Clegg, when it was the coalition, I guess what defined things wasn't the speech outside Downing Street. What defined things was the press conference in the Rose Garden. I'm interested from the two of you who are most involved in that, how you strike the right tone in that kind of situation. Because when you're arriving in government with an atmosphere of huge uncertainty, real uncharted territory, how do you decide what the priorities are?
Well, the priority for Nick's speech, which as far as I can recollect, I wrote. I feel like somebody might second guess me on that, but I'm pretty sure I did. But I reused a line, actually, that he'd used in the leadership election with Chris Huhne, which was, yesterday we were rivals and today we are colleagues. Mm-hmm. But, sometimes as a speechwriter, you're very much like telling your principal what you think they should say. Sometimes you are really just scribing their thoughts and finding some good words for it. And Nick was absolutely clear that he had signed a deal for 5 years and that the objective was to be colleagues, not rivals, and that he was going to make this government work, and they would navigate the tensions and the difficulties together behind closed doors in what emerged as the Quad. And that's what he said. And people then laughed at it as a bromance, all of that. Both parties resisted it a bit, and over time it came to symbolise the sort of sense that both of them had somehow sold out. I don't think either of them sold out. I think both of them felt that it was the right thing to do for the country to have a project grounded in trust and sincerity and not be constantly saying, oh, the Lib Dems are better than, Nick could have given a different speech, and he chose to give the bromance speech, and all I did was write it down for him.
Perhaps an odd parallel between Burnham now and Cameron then is that he was arriving in Downing Street in what on paper kind of looked like a position of weakness, right? Like a prime minister has just fallen, you're picking up the pieces, and yet he clearly made a conscious decision with how he presented it to turn it into a position of strength.
So first of all, I've always felt that Nick Clegg was immensely impressive in that moment. I mean, he said when we did the podcast with him, it was all about the numbers, but I actually think that was modest. I think it was a lot about his own political leadership, and what the two of them achieved, him as well as David, at that moment was an exceptional act of boldness, imagination, creativity, political leadership that provided the country with stable government for 5 years at a critical moment when the country was in a lot of financial trouble. So I think one can underestimate that. If Andy Burnham succeeds in the kind of imagination necessary for that, and I don't rule out that is a possibility. Okay, so first of all, he has been bold in fighting Makerfield and winning it by a long way. He's got a message that ties to his political success, and he's got quite a far-reaching plan, which is not entirely impractical. You can do, and it's not implausible either. It's possible. One can certainly argue against it, but it's very possible that if you decentralised power in this way, you'd create several different centres of economic growth in the country. So there is a real project which is practical and deliverable, and he's been quite imaginative in dealing with it. So I've disagreed with people who've sort of gone, this is bound to fail, it's just Starmer again. It's a very, very hard position to be in. Fiscally, it's very hard. Electorally, you can see the Labour Party's position is very poor. There's now this contest for their base with reform, which is hard to deliver, but it's not, without any question, it's not dead on arrival.
Whatever his speech outside Downing Street, he's pretty soon going to have to give another one at the Labour Party conference. Danny, that's a more important speech.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, I think I'm sure we've all three been involved in doing many of those. And in my case anyway, it certainly took a week of sitting in a sort of room in a college, in a technical college in Darlington, working on this iteration after iteration after iteration to get every single word of the speech right. But you have to start with, and this is Polly's point before, knowing broadly what it is you want to say.
Sally, when do you start worrying about that?
About the speech?
The conference speech. Are you always worrying about it?
Well, I mean, the first draft of Tony's speeches used to take place over August. He would go on holiday and start writing. He always said, what's the argument? What's the argument? He always started with the argument. And then people like Peter Hyman and Alistair and various people used to bash around and produce stuff. Then there was about 5 pages of quite boring policy that we used to try and whittle down to 3. And then I guarantee you on the Monday night of conference, there'd be absolute high drama. It was rubbish. The whole thing was a disaster. It had all gone wrong, and that was usually midnight Monday.
And by the time this happens, by the time, we all go to Liverpool for the conference, by the time you get to go home, the whole sort of messianic, slightly North Korean atmosphere in the Labour Party, that's kind of sort of dissipated by then, isn't it, Sally?
I think it's going to be quite an interesting period. I mean, I think August will be, some photos, some meetings, some events, whatever. I think then Parliament returns. You've got 2 weeks where there is some quite serious politics. Then there's a break in preparation for conference. So I don't think we're North Korean, but I do think conferences are always special, and the first conference speech that a leader gives is really, really special. So it's a huge deal, frankly.
What are the chances that Sally's saying, I don't think we're North Korean, gets a tick on Barry's list? I think almost certainly. And we've had a voice note from David.
Hi team. Can Camp Binface win? Or even if not, has Nigel Farage already lost?
Danny, can Camp Binface win, or is Nigel Farage already lost?
Well, anything can happen, but is he going to win? No. The chances are vanishingly small. The only circumstance in which a sort of alternative candidate from outside the political system could win that by-election would be a really, really strong revolt against the sitting MP in that constituency, and it doesn't look like there is that. But Nigel Farage has, I think he has lost some initiative over this, or he means to control the political agenda. This was intended to reassert his control. It hasn't worked. The others didn't fight him. Facing Count Binface has sort of brought home the slight ludicrousness of it. It means that every day of that by-election is a repetition of this point about him receiving £5 million in secret as a personal gift from a Thai cryptocurrency billionaire, and which is not a good story for anyone. And I think he'll almost certainly win, but he has to turn out the whole of the reform by-election infrastructure to make sure that the turnout's large enough that he's not embarrassed by the small showing. So that means the company's put a lot of effort into something that will ultimately prove meaningless, and during it will damage him. So it's probably not a terminal disaster, but it's not a terminal disaster, right? Take the word probably out of it. But it was... But it's certainly a backwards move. It's not been a good thing for him. He has lost some ground over it.
He's trying to turn the conversation into one that is about security. And my hunch is that they will have done some focus groups and exploration and confirmed that that's the best piece of land to stand on to defend this £5 million is Nigel Farage being under personal threat. And of course, he's right to be concerned about his own security. It would be nice if he was more concerned about other MPs' security. Interestingly, Zia Yusuf was out and about yesterday still saying that he considers Conservative MPs to be traitors, which doesn't feel to me like somebody who's broadly concerned about parliamentary security. But nevertheless, there is legs in this question of security for MPs and whether Parliament makes the right judgments, whether enough resources are put into it. And they are pushing at that. I think it would be sensible of government to find a way to actually respond reduce some of those concerns. You know, we know that huge numbers of MPs face regular death threats, including on the internet, but including more kind of proactive and aggressive than that. There have been MPs who've been stalked, and really having a national reset moment, not to give a victory to Nigel Farage, but in fact almost to not give him a victory. He's right. MPs should be safe.
I mean, I think Siobhan has called for, has said that they're going to review MPs' security. I mean, he did turn down the security that was offered, which is quite bizarre. So it's all, it's all well and good saying, well, because I need better. And now he's saying again that's why he took the money, although he said 3 weeks ago that wasn't why he took the money. So it's all a bit confusing. I mean, I would say two things. I mean, firstly, it's really rather amusing that they've had to take all their resources, so far as I can see, out of Manchester to now put them in Clacton. So who would have thought that they were going to do that sort of thing? And secondly, it's obvious that until this by-election, he hasn't been in Clacton very much. So the first video they put out, and it was 32 degrees or something, had him in full winter gear, because obviously that was the last time he was in Clacton. So he was in a tweed jacket and a big scarf and all the rest of it. And it was summer, and he hasn't been there. So now he will have to spend quite a few weeks in Clacton.
He took the money in order to, because he wanted to be financially secure while he was the MP for Clacton, and his allies inside Reform thought he wasn't going to run. They needed him to run, so therefore they needed to make him financially secure. Whether he was aware of their motivation in giving him the gift, I don't know, but I would think that's very likely.
The front page
was
of the Guardian today suggests that he very much was. That's the story
they're suggesting.
Sorry, no, Polly, you first.
Well, it's clear that he genuinely feels that he's like doing us a favour by staying in politics and not going to make proper money in the United States. And I find that so fascinating, because it is so antithetical to the idea of public service. You know, I think it's perfectly fine for people to go and make lots of money having jobs. Fine. If you want a career in public life and public service, that comes with sacrifices. Some big, some small. It also comes with maybe you get to meet Gary Lineker or whatever it might be. But it's a choice, and it's a choice that he made for himself. I don't know, it smacks of the grifter to me to think that you uniquely are entitled to a senior position in public life and a buttload of money.
So look, I'm always fascinated by the way public moods never last. You know, people think a thing, people come to think the opposite thing. If you look at Clacton, nominations haven't closed, but there are already lots of independents standing. They include not just Count Binface, but also Mr. Fishfinger, who's an engineer from Doncaster, who says his message will be, say ta-ta to Nige, you'll find us much better. Here's Corbyn is standing. It's going to be a sort of oddballs paradise. And I've been really...
There's lots of foxes.
The foxes pulled out. He was worried he wasn't going to be taken seriously. He said this yesterday. He said,
are there any women?
I mean, probably not. I honestly don't know. Maybe it's one of them could wear out a fox hat. But this is sort of my point. So I was really struck. I've been struck over the last couple of days by the slight anti-Binface mood growing, and I really had a flicker of it myself, fond as I am of Binface, a flicker of it yesterday at PMQs when Keir Starmer chortled away and said people in Clacton should put your vote in the bin. And you look at everyone chortling away and you think, Patrick Maguire made this point very, very well when we did PMQs yesterday, that you're kind of like, well, hang on, it's like, I know this is a laugh, I know Nigel Farage has made a fool of himself, but this is our system, this is our democracy, this is real, this matters. And to have all these establishment figures chortling away about foxes and people in capes, that can go wrong.
He's the joke candidate in this by-election, because this by-election is unnecessary. I feel as somebody fought for Parliament twice and didn't get in, I feel particularly strongly about this. I think becoming a Member of Parliament is a real honour and a responsibility, a complete privilege, and not to be trifled with. And he's basically done that. He's trifled with it in order to make some political point, as if the people are the people in Clacton, which they are not. You know, they're just people in Clacton. And I understand they're his electorate, but they're not. They don't represent anything more than that. And him, therefore, winning or not winning him winning a by-election there doesn't have any more sort of importance than that. So I just feel the whole thing is a big political stunt, and he's no less the joke candidate than all the others.
In many ways, it would have been brilliant if just he'd stood and then nobody else had stood, and it had been a really, really, really low turnout, actually. I mean, that's what I would have quite liked. A sort of, yes, he wins, but on a pathetically low turnout, which may well happen.
Well, I think it might well happen.
I don't think the campaign face is particularly funny. No. The manifestos...
I quite find him funny.
But again, it's not that he's aggressively unfunny. I'm not offended by his unfunniness. This is an unnecessary by-election. Therefore, all the normal rules are off. Right? If this was a general election or an ordinary by-election where Nigel Farage was standing and everyone was sort of treating him as a pariah who couldn't be stood against, that would be weird, and I would be encouraging us to take the election seriously. This is not an election that should be taken seriously because it didn't need to happen. It's a political stunt, and that's the end of it.
Polly, I've just been informed that there is a woman standing. Her name is Amy Morris. She's an independent. I do not know if she has like a fish on her head or something, presumably. But look, before we move on from this, Sally, is there a school of thought that says, actually, you look at what's happening in Clacton, you look at what's happening with Nigel Farage generally, and with Reform generally, and Labour's got this badly wrong. The Labour spent the first part of this year tearing themselves apart. They've thrown out a Prime Minister who, I mean, some people would say was actually sort of doing all right, even if it didn't always look that way. And actually, they could have just sat back and waited for Reform to tear itself apart, as keen Reform watchers would have said it was always going to.
No.
Thanks for letting me ask the whole question.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think the government. I think his government was just doomed, really, because it didn't know what it was for. So I think it had to stop. And I think, actually, I mean, I feel more optimistic that Reform are in trouble than Danny does. I think not just in Clacton, where I think it's just a farce, but I think in general they are somewhat more on the run. Partly because Farage himself is no longer Teflon in the way that perhaps we thought he was, but also because I think Andy Burnham will actually be quite good at talking to that part of the electorate. So, I think there's reason to be a bit optimistic that Reform are on the down.
Do you think, Danny, the fact that Reform are on the down actually changed, just had Labour known what was going to happen, they might have just calmed down a bit over the past 6 months?
I think they would have been making a mistake if they had.
Right.
Because, we've established this idea. They've got to be able to fight the next election and on either Britain's on the right track, don't turn back, it's time for a change, or better the devil you know. And they were being left with that third one, which wasn't the strongest one, right? So they this would simply have made this, what's happened to Nigel Farage would have made this campaign, the better the devil you know campaign, easier to fight. But they still would have. They're still better off on Britain's on the right track if they can get on the right track and know what the track is.
Well, look, that's it from us. Thank you very much indeed to Sally, to Polly and Danny. I've been Hugo Rifkind. We'll be wheeling our lectern back into your podcast feeds at the same time next week. Thanks for all your messages. See you then.